Okay, so in this video we're going to try to wrap up this scene and getting it to render pretty good. So one other effect that I want to add to the scene is using flare effects that we can render out with Mental Ray to pretty much bring out these stars and make them look a little bit more interesting. Because right now if I just do render region over that starlight over there that I created, you really can't see it. All you can see is the background image there of the star field there. So what can we do to change that? Well, in XSI we can add something called lens flare effects to our lights. So what I'll do is I'll select the light and I'll go ahead and add a property to it. Now one thing to note is that the property menu here changes depending on which toolbar you're using. So if I'm in the model mode over here and I go to property, I can't get my lens flare effect from here. I also can't get it if I go to the animate property menu. I can only get it if I go to the render property menu, and you'll find it right here, lens flare. So go ahead and click on that with your light selected, and that'll add a lens flare property to your light. And you'll see the PPG pops up. I'm going to go ahead and lock that down. And the first tab allows you to enable or disable the effect. And then we have a flare tab, a glow tab, and a star tab. So let's start to adjust some of this stuff to get this lens flare effect to look good. If I go ahead and do a render region around this, you'll notice that we end up with a blown out flare effect that obviously doesn't look too good. It kind of looks like that star exploded and our little planet over here is in danger. Let me go ahead and lower the anti-aliasing pretty drastically there on the render region just so it renders faster. Okay? What we need to do is select a better lens flare effect for this starlight back there. So what I'm going to do to accomplish that is change my settings over here in the flare PPG. So in the first tab, the flare tab, what I want to do is leave the flare file to none. And I'm going to take the brightness. I really need to knock that down a lot. This is a very sensitive parameter. So I'm going to go down to about 0.001 to knock down the brightness by a really good amount. If I do a little test render there, see what we have. And that still doesn't look too good. So let's take the size and do the same thing, 0.001. Knock that down and see what we get there. And still nothing. So let's move on to another tab. We're going to skip the glow tab because I'm not going to add any glow to this star, to this flare effect. I'm just going to skip on over to the star tab over here. And we have stars activated. The brightness is probably set up too high. The default setting of 1 for our scene is way too high. So let's go to something like 0.001 and see what we get. Okay, so we get a much smaller star here, which looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and increase the brightness a little bit. Let me try 0.004. Okay, it's a little bit bright, but let's see if we can fix that. Let me change the number of rays to about 4. I don't want too many rays. It looks too cheesy. That looks a little bit better, but let's go ahead and see what other changes we can make. Let's change the length parameter here because right now it's too high. So let's just knock it down to something pretty low. Let's try, well, 0.2. It's just a number that I'm playing around with here. And it made the length of the flare rays drop right there. So let's drop it some more. So that's 0.075. And that drops it a pretty good amount. And let's take the jitter here and knock that down as well. Let's try something like 0.2, somewhere in the 0.2 range, see what we get. Not much of a change there. So let's go ahead and change the thickness. Let's drop it. Let's cut it down to 0.1. Okay, that's pretty good. And let's take the rotation. Let's give this thing some rotation. Let's rotate it about 100 degrees, just so it looks a little bit more interesting. There it is. So now it's kind of at an angle. Let's try increasing that by a little bit, something like this. See what that does for us. Okay, rotated it a little bit more. Looks pretty cool. Okay, I think I'm just going to go ahead and leave that like that. The length parameter here, maybe I'll drop the length just a little bit so it looks like a really far away star. So let's drop that to something like 0.03. See what that gives us. That's pretty good. Looks like a very far away star there. A little bit hard to see, very faint. Less is more in this case. I'm going to go with something like that. I don't want it to look too obvious or stand out too much. Just this small star very far away in the background. And remember that that light is actually serving a dual purpose. Its main purpose is to light up my star field created with ice. Its secondary purpose, which isn't really that important, is to create that flare effect. At least for this star, it's not that important. So now let's select the second star up here, or the second light, the second star light. Let's go back to the property menu and add a lens flare to that one as well. Okay, so let's go to the first tab, the flare tab here. Let's also create a render region of the area so we can see what's going on. Okay, while it renders, I'll just go through these parameters. As you can see, it's blown out too much, so that isn't very good. Another thing that affects this intensity of the flare effect is the intensity of the light. Since this light in particular has an intensity of 500, the flare effect is going to be very, very strong. Same thing with this smaller starlight over here, the first one. It had an intensity of 200, which is actually pretty high. That's why the flare effect was so blown out. So let me come over here and change the brightness, and I'll do the same thing, 0.001. And obviously I already know from experience that the size is going to have to go down to 0.001 as well. And let's go over here to the star tab and let's make some changes over here. Let's go to the brightness here and knock that down to about 0.2. We're going to get less brightness there. And the number of rays I'm also going to change to 2 rays. And 2 rays is going to give us actually a pretty interesting effect you'll see in a moment. So we get this sort of vertical flare effect that just goes up and down. But you also notice it's got these sort of lines that cut into it. And don't worry, we'll be working on that in a moment. For the length, let's knock it down to something really, really low, like 0.05. Just to get that length down. It's a little bit too long right now. I don't want the effect to be blown out. Okay, that's a little bit better, so the length doesn't go that far. So it's getting interesting. And the thickness, I'm going to leave alone. All this stuff I'm going to leave alone. I'm going to go back to the flare tab over here. I'm going to take the aspect ratio and I'm going to knock that down to about 0.1. You're going to see what that gives us. The aspect ratio will, in essence, pretty much squeeze the effect, as you can see right here. So now we get this sort of strange space phenomenon, this sort of flare effect where it just goes up and down in a vertical sort of line. But we also want to select a flare file for this. Right now it's set to none. I want to actually give this a flare file. So the flare file that I want to give this, we're going to go in here in this drop down menu and we can see we have a lot of different options. You can sit here for a long time testing out these different flare files that come with XSI to see which one you like. I've already chosen one that looks pretty good for this circumstance. Of course, feel free to go in there and explore and test out different flare files. The one I'm going to go ahead and choose is called dimmed and small. So I'll select that one and we'll see it update here in the render region. Okay, there we go. Now to complete the effect for this specific flare effect, unlike the other flare effect, I'm going to actually add some glow to this one. So I'll go ahead and check on glow. It's going to add some glow effect to this. And it might be too strong, and it is. It's way too strong and it pretty much kills the effect. So what I'm going to do is knock down the brightness to about something like 0.5. That should give us a much dimmer glow effect, and it doesn't. So let's knock down the size to about 1.2. See what that gives us. Very small size here. There we go. That looks much more interesting. So that looks kind of cool, like something happened in some galaxy far away over there in that nebula. Okay. All right. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to close that render region. Let's add a flare effect to our sun. So there's our sun. Right now, if we render out the sun there, we don't really see anything, which doesn't look too interesting, of course. So let's select the sun over here, and let's go to property and add a lens flare effect to that. Okay, let's start off over here on the flare tab and work our way through here. I have a flare file that I've already chosen for this, and of course, like before, feel free to explore and check out any of these flare files you'd like. The one I'm going to use is called Real Bright Small. So let's look for Real Bright Small. There it is, real bright small. And let's also take the brightness here and let's knock it down to about 0.5. The size is also going to have to be knocked down. I don't want the size to be too small though. And I want to give this some aspect ratio here, so I'm going to go something like 0.8 just to make the shape look more interesting. And let's start to create some render regions here to see what we have. Okay, so we can see that looks pretty interesting, and I like the effect being pretty strong because it makes sense. It's a nearby star in this solar system here, whatever this is. So let's go over here to the Start tab, and let's start to play with some of these settings. The brightness I'm going to leave alone because I don't want this to be a dim star that's far away. I want to take the number of rays and knock that down to about 5. I don't want so many rays on this particular effect. The length I'm just going to probably drop down by a little bit, maybe 0.3. The jitter I'm going to leave alone. Thickness here, let's go ahead and drop this thickness down to something pretty low. Let's go to 0.05 and see what we get there. Okay, not too bad. And let me see, all this other stuff I'm going to leave alone. Let's go to the glow tab and let's add some glow. And I'm just going to go ahead and go with the default settings here. Looks pretty good. So this is pretty much set up. So let me go ahead and close that. I have these camera view, these recorded camera destination points up here that I've already recorded. As you can see, I'm going to go ahead and select this one right here and do a render preview. That was the 4th camera record button up here, the orange one. I'm going to record from this angle right here. Now, of course, you can move your camera to any angle you want and record from there. So this is what we get right here. Looks pretty interesting actually so far. Okay, there's another change that I want to make to the scene. If I come in here and I do a render, let's see what we have from the front. I haven't even rendered this planet from the front here. Okay, there we go. We got the nice little atmospheric effect. I created a custom shader for this planet that gives us this incidence angle that allows us to see this this sort of atmosphere type effect right there on the planet. And if you go ahead and open up the render tree for this planet, you can see the shader network that I created for it using several different maps as well as some mixing nodes and a couple of incidence nodes, as you can see. Alright, so let's come in here, let's make another change. I'm going to go over here to my render options and I'm going to go to the pass options. And in my pass options, I'm going to go to the pass shaders, and down here you're going to see a lens shader stack area. Now by default it's set to use only the camera lens shaders that are attached to the camera. Since I don't have any lens shaders attached to the camera, what I'm going to do instead is go down here to overwrite camera lens shaders. That'll allow me to add a shader here which is going to overwrite any lens shader in my scene with the lens shader that I use here at the pass level, which is a pretty neat way of working in this case. So I'm going to click on add and a browser is going to pop up and it's going to pretty much allow me to go ahead and choose whatever shader I want. By default I'm taken to the default lens shader folder here in XSI. If you were taken to this lens shader, just go over here to the mental images folder and you'll find a shader called MIA photographic exposure. Let's go ahead and bring that one in, and then let's double click on it here in the list to open up its PPG to make some changes. The photographic exposure lens shader is a very neat shader. It allows you to do tone mapping and some post-processing to your render. You can do some different types of color correction, tone mapping, fix up the gamma curve, increase the exposure, decrease it, different things like that, which is pretty cool. Usually you do that in post-production, but this shader allows you to do it right here within Mental Ray, which is pretty neat. So let's go ahead and test this stuff out and see what we can get. So first thing I'm going to do is come in here and maybe do a render region of this, or a render preview I should say. And this probably isn't going to be the best angle. You can see the effect is already affecting, well, the effect is affecting our scene here. Let me go ahead and pin this PPG down and let me go back to this this position here using my little camera record button there. And I'm going to go ahead and do a render preview and move it over here to the side. And you can see what we get. Looks a little bit dark. The effect here was toned down a bit with the photographic exposure shader. You can see the sun effect has been toned down quite a bit. So let's make some changes here to make this look a little bit better. The first thing I'm going to do is increase the gamma. Normally you would go for gamma curve of about 2.2, and we'll see what that gives us. Gamma correction is very important when doing your renders. Make sure you get the right amount of gamma. But in this case, it washed down my image a little bit, and I don't like the way it looks too much. So I'm going to reduce that gamma to about 1.8. Okay, so we end up with this. But I want to go ahead and increase my saturation because my image is losing some of its colorness or colorfulness, so to speak. So I'll increase the saturation from 1 to 1.25. So I'll give it about 2.25 more saturation, and this will introduce more color into the image, into the render. A little bit more, which looks pretty subtle. That nebula effect looks awesome back there. Now for the allowed underexposure, I'm going to leave it at the default, which is 0.25, but I'm going to also allow some overexposure as well. And I'm going to go to as high as 0.7, which is a pretty high value, by the way. This is going to give some overexposure to our render like this, which looks pretty cool. Now that I like. You can see the sun is affecting the scene more. It looks very bright. The nebulas are also pretty bright, and even our planet looks a little bit brighter, and the image looks a little bit healthier, a little bit better. Then we have this vignetting parameter here, and I'm just going to knock that down to 0. And we'll talk more about this parameter and a lot of these parameters in this shader in another video down the road, where I'm going to go ahead and explain all these parameters, and we'll go over this shader in detail. So for now, don't worry about it. We'll just close that, and our render's actually looking pretty good. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to render this planet or this scene from different angles. So I'm going to go ahead with an angle like this so I can see that those two starlights in the distance and whatnot, as well as my planet over here. So let's do a render preview of that and see what we have. And it's very good to do preview renders of different angles of your scene just to see how stuff's coming out. Okay, maybe behind the planet shot. Okay, that looks pretty cool. All right, so when we want to create a final render, let's go over here to the render manager, and let's fix up our settings here. Let's go back to output. You can choose whatever preset you want for the size of the render. So you can render in HD, you can render an NTSC DV or a PAL format. Whatever you really want is up to you. Or you can use a custom format. So you can just go to custom format and change and tweak your pixel ratio. You can unlock your aspect ratio. You can change the width and the height. You can also go ahead and change the amount of anti-aliasing here. So I would go with something like a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 3. And then also change your sampling contrast here to something lower, like 0.1 or 0.05 will work out very well for doing a final render. And also in the frame buffer, we want to switch from a Gaussian filter. Usually I like to use a Mitchell filter with a filter size of about 4, which comes out pretty good. And then over here for the actual size of the render, you can go with anything that you really want. So let's go with maybe 700 here, see what we get there. And everything else looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go over here to one of these angles and do a preview render at that size. And I'll pause the video just because this will take a little while to render here. Okay, so it's wrapping up the render here, and I'll just go ahead and close out this video. As you can see, our render's coming out excellent. We can see all our stars. Looks very interesting there, that nebula. And it's very hard to tell the difference between the stars that are created with ice and the stars that were a part of the alpha cards that I placed in the scene. And that's thanks to that brand new Loom beam shader that I was able to pipe in there for the shader network on the ice point cloud, the ice stars, that allows us to have this variation in colors, as you can see here, and intensities with those different stars. So some look like they're closer or farther away, and they mix up with these alpha cards perfectly. Very seamless. Okay, so there's our final render. Hope you enjoyed this part of the tutorial. We have a lot more coming up, so we're only getting started here with Mental Ray. So I'm going to end this video here. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and pick up and start working on another production example scene, which will deviate in subject matter. We'll go to a totally different type of scene and work with some different lighting techniques to show you more Mental Ray tools.